My name's Mark Riley. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army, and I didn't believe in God. Not in heaven, not in hell, not in any of it. And on May 14th, 2007, in the dust and heat of Ramadi, Iraq, I died. But that wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of the real one. Before that day, my world was simple. It was made of things I could see and touch. Matter and energy. Cause and effect. You're born. You live. You die. That's it. I'd watch my buddies before a mission, clutching their crosses or whispering a little prayer. I saw it as a crutch, a good luck charm to get them through the fear. I didn't need one. My faith was in my M4 rifle and my training, and in the guys to my left and right. That morning was supposed to be easy. A simple hearts and minds run, delivering school supplies. The Iraqi sun was blinding, cooking the air until it shimmered over the asphalt. I remember seeing kids on the side of the road waving. It was one of those quiet days, the kind that makes you drop your guard just a little, the kind that gets you killed. We were rolling down the street when I saw it. Just a glint of light, something out of place by a pile of trash. I opened my mouth to shout, but the world beat me to it. There wasn't a big Hollywood boom at first. Just a high-pitched whine that drilled into my skull, and then a silent, violent punch of pressure that ripped everything apart. I didn't feel any pain. I just felt the sunlight being yanked away, replaced by a deep, crushing darkness that swallowed everything. Before I wore the uniform, my life was gray. I managed a small hardware store back in Ohio. The days all had the same taste, like stale coffee. I'd wake up, stare at the water-stained ceiling of my cheap apartment, and feel nothing. It wasn't sadness. It was just an absence of everything else. The world was a machine, and I was just another cog, turning without any real purpose. I had a girlfriend for a while. Her name was Jenna. She was the kind of person who'd point out shapes in the clouds and talk about fate. She went to church every Sunday, and she'd come back with this light in her eyes. She'd look at me and say, "Mark, you just have to open your heart." I'd just smile, but on the inside I was thinking, open it to what? To an empty room? We loved each other, I think, but we were speaking different languages. It was like I was colorblind and she was trying to describe a rainbow. The argument started small. She'd thank God for a beautiful day. I'd credit the high-pressure system moving in from the west. She saw a plan. I saw a series of cosmic accidents. The final break came on a rainy Tuesday. She was crying, her voice barely a whisper. She said, "I can't live in a world with no magic, Mark, and that's the only world you'll let yourself see." She was right. After she left, the silence in that apartment was louder than any explosion I'd ever hear. That was a different kind of void. That's the secret no one knew. That's why I enlisted. It wasn't some big patriotic calling. It was an escape. I was running from that silent apartment, from that gray, meaningless life. The Army made sense to me. It was concrete. There were rules. There were objectives. You follow orders, you watch your six, you keep your brothers safe. There was no room for faith or destiny or magic. There was only the mission. It was the only place where I felt like my life had a clear, definable purpose, even if that purpose was just to make it to tomorrow. But even out there, in the sand and the heat, you can't outrun yourself. At night, when everything was quiet except for the hum of the generators, I'd lie on my cot and stare into the dark, and I'd feel that same old nothingness creeping back in. I had traded one empty room for another, just with different walls. I thought I had everything figured out, that I was the smart one who saw the world for what it really was. But what if the person who is truly blind is the one who refuses to see there might be more than just darkness? The day it happened, it started out different, not in a big way, in a small, unsettling way that gets under your skin. The air in Ramadi always had a sound, always. A mix of distant calls to prayer, barking dogs, the rumble of generators. But that morning there was nothing, just a dead, heavy silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels loud. I remember standing outside the wire, the sun just starting to bake the dust, and the silence felt wrong. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. My squad leader, a guy named Henderson who'd seen it all, he felt it too. I saw him just standing there scanning the rooftops, his jaw tight. He caught my eye and just gave this tiny shake of his head. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We both knew. Silence in a war zone isn't peace. It's a warning. But what do? You can't call off a mission because of a hunch. So we loaded up. I chalked it up to nerves. Just another day at the office. Then came the second sign. As our Humvee turned onto the main street, the market was almost empty. Usually it was chaos. People shouting, vendors selling everything you could imagine, but that day it was a ghost town. Just a few old men sitting in the shade watching us pass. And one of them, he looked right at me. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. His face was just filled with this deep, profound sadness, like he was looking at a ghost. He put his hand over his heart and looked down. I felt a cold spike go right through my gut. My hand tightened on my rifle. But what happened next was even worse. Inside my own head, something was screaming at me. It wasn't a thought. It was a raw, primal feeling. A voice with no words that just said, wrong, wrong, wrong. Every instinct I had, honed by months in that place, was telling me to stop the convoy, to turn back. I could feel the sweat trickling down my spine, cold despite the 100-degree heat. I glanced at the other guys. They were laughing, joking about what they'd do on leave. They didn't feel it. It was just me. Because I couldn't explain it, because I couldn't put it on a map or point to a specific threat, I said nothing. How could I? The guy who didn't believe in anything telling his team he had a bad feeling. They would have laughed me out of the truck, so I pushed it down. I ignored the silence. I ignored the old man's eyes. I ignored the alarm bells going off in my own soul. I told myself it was just the heat getting to me. I was the rational one, remember? The one who saw the world as it was, a series of explainable events. But I was about to learn that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the one you refuse to believe exists. And he was waiting for us just a few hundred yards down that quiet, empty street. The Humvee kept rolling forward, a slow, heavy crawl into that suffocating silence. The heat was a physical thing, pressing in on us. I remember looking at PFC Evans, a kid barely 19, sitting across from me. He was showing a picture of his newborn daughter to another soldier, his face lit up with a smile that just didn't belong in that place. That's the last thing I saw in the world of the living. A smile. Then my eyes caught it. Caught on the side of the road next to a pile of rotting trash and broken concrete. It wasn't much, just a glint. A tiny flash of sunlight bouncing off something that shouldn't have been there. It could have been anything, a piece of glass, a tin can. But my gut, the one I had just ignored, seized up like a fist. It was a wire. A thin, almost invisible copper wire running from the trash pile into a drain. I opened my mouth. I think the word I was trying to form was stop. It felt like it was moving in slow motion, my brain screaming at my lungs trying to force the air out. But the world beat me to it. There wasn't a Hollywood boom. Not at first. It was a sharp, deafening crack, like the sky itself had split in two, and then came the pressure. It wasn't a sound you hear with your ears. It was a physical blow you feel with your bones. A silent, violent punch that hit our Humvee and turned the world into a chaotic storm of fire and metal. I was thrown against the door so hard I felt my ribs splinter. The air was sucked out of my lungs, replaced with fire and dust. In that last fraction of a second, as the world tore itself apart around me, my life didn't flash before my eyes. There was no grand revelation. My final thought was for Jenna. I saw her face, her sad eyes on that rainy Tuesday. And all I could think was, you were right. Then all the noise, all the fire, all the chaos just stopped. It was like someone grabbed the plug and yanked it from the wall. The sunlight wasn't just blocked by smoke. It was gone. Snatched away. Replaced by a deep, crushing, and absolute darkness. I didn't feel my body anymore. I didn't feel the pain. I just felt me, my consciousness. And I was being pulled down, away from everything, into a blackness so thick and cold it felt like a physical place. This was it. The great nothingness I had always preached about. The empty, meaningless void at the end of it all. And as I sank into it, I finally understood true terror. I had been right all along. And I had never been more wrong in my entire life. That feeling of sinking, it wasn't a gentle drift. It was a violent downward plunge, like being caught in an undertow in a sea of ink. There was no air, no pressure, just a complete and total absence of everything. For a second, there was a strange sense of detachment, almost clinical. The sergeant in me was still trying to analyze the situation. Okay, you're dead. Assess. But there was nothing to assess. There were no reference points. No up, no down, no body. It was just me. A single point of awareness adrift in an endless, silent, black ocean. Then something shifted. I didn't have eyes, but I could see. Not with light, but with knowing. I was looking down at the street, at the wreckage of our Humvee, twisted and burning like a crushed soda can. I saw my guys, some moving, some not. I saw the medics rushing in, and I saw me, my body. It was slumped against the ruined door, unnaturally still. My eyes were open, staring blankly at a sky I could no longer see. There was no grief. Not yet. Just a profound, horrifying disconnect. It was like looking at an old uniform you'd thrown away. It used to be you, but it wasn't anymore. But what happened next was even worse. As I watched the chaos unfold below, I felt a pull. A heavy, insistent tug away from that scene of fire and life. Away from the light. It was pulling me down, deeper into that suffocating blackness. And with the pull came a cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that makes you shiver. It was a spiritual cold, a deep-seated chill that went straight to the core of who I was, extinguishing any warmth, any hope. It was the feeling of absolute, eternal loneliness. I tried to fight it. I tried to swim back up, back toward the world, back toward the light. But I had nothing to swim with. I was just a thought, a memory being dragged into the abyss. The silence I was in started to change. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It felt hungry. It felt like a presence. I realized then, with a terror that dwarfed anything I'd ever felt on any battlefield, that this wasn't the end. This wasn't the great nothingness I had expected. This was something else. This was a place, a destination, and I had just arrived. I had spent my whole life telling people like Jenna that there was nothing waiting for us on the other side. But as I sank deeper into that active, malevolent darkness, I understood the first terrible truth of the afterlife. There is no such thing as nothing. There is only something. And I was being delivered, gift-trapped, to the Lord of that terrible place. Have you ever had a moment where you realized everything you believed was completely and utterly wrong? Subscribe and hit that bell, because what I met in that darkness, and who came to pull me out of it, is a story you need to hear. I'll be sharing more of what I was shown in the next video. When he spoke my name, the darkness didn't just retreat. It was unmade, obliterated. I was no longer sinking in a cold, black ocean. I was somewhere else. It wasn't a place you could find on a map. It was a place made of feeling. The primary feeling was love, not the kind of love you read about. This was a living, breathing force. It was in the air, if you could call it air. It was the light, if you could call it light. The light was everywhere. It wasn't blinding like the Iraqi sun. It was warm, golden, and it felt like it was coming from inside me as much as from outside. It was like bathing in the most perfect sunrise you've ever seen, a sunrise that healed you instead of just warming your skin. Every fear I had, every ounce of cynicism, every scar on my soul was just dissolved. I felt whole for the first time in my life. I felt known. And he stood there, Jesus. I didn't see a halo or a long flowing robe. I saw a man. He had the eyes of a warrior and a carpenter and a king all at once. But the main thing, the thing that brought me to my knees without even having knees, was the look on his face. It wasn't a look of "I told you so." It was a look of pure, gut-wrenching compassion, like a father finding his son who had been lost for a very, very long time. There was no condemnation for my disbelief. There was only a profound sadness for me, for the pain I had put myself through by shutting him out. We didn't speak with mouths. The communication was instant. It was a stream of pure knowledge and feeling flowing directly into my consciousness. He showed me my life, not like a movie, but from a perspective I could never have imagined. I saw myself in that gray apartment after Jenna left. But this time I saw him there too, a presence of light in the corner of the room, grieving with me, waiting for me to just look up. I saw myself in Ramadi, ignoring that gut feeling, and I saw his hand trying to shield me, trying to warn me. He had been there the whole time. That was the first staggering revelation. My loneliness had been a choice. I was the one who had locked the door. Then he showed me what I had been running from. He let me feel, just for a second, the true nature of that dark, cold place I'd been pulled into. It wasn't just an absence of God, it was an active, hateful intelligence that fed on despair. It was the source of the coldness I'd felt my whole life, the voice that whispered, "You're alone. It's all meaningless." My atheism hadn't been an intellectual position. It had been an open invitation for that darkness to settle in my soul. I had been living in a cell with the door wide open, convinced it was the entire world. But what he showed me next changed everything. He didn't just show me my past. He showed me a web of light connecting everyone. Every small act of kindness I'd ever done, even begrudgingly, sent out ripples of light that touched people I'd never met. And every harsh word, every selfish act, created a little tear in that beautiful web. It wasn't about earning points for heaven. It was about a simple truth. We were all connected, and our purpose was to either strengthen those connections with love or weaken them with selfishness. My whole life I had been a machine of cause and effect. Now I saw the real cause and effect was love. His voice, which was not a sound but a perfect, undeniable thought inside me, gave me my new orders. Your time has not yet come. What you have seen you must now speak. You who were blind will be my witness. There was no room to argue. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a purpose. The very thing my soul had been starving for my entire life, handed to me in a place beyond life itself. I wanted to stay. God, I wanted to stay in that light, in that love, forever. But I knew I couldn't. This wasn't my home. Not yet. He put a hand on my shoulder, a touch that was both weightless and more solid than anything on earth, and the perfect peace I felt was replaced by a sense of mission. I was a soldier again. But this time I knew who I was fighting for. What would you do if you were given a second chance, but it meant leaving heaven to come back to a broken world? Subscribe and hit the bell, because how I came back to life and what happened when I tried to tell everyone what I saw is a story you won't want to miss. I'll be sharing more stories just like this one. The peace was so absolute, so complete, that the thought of leaving was like trying to imagine choosing to drown after being rescued from a shipwreck. I wanted to stay, more than I had ever wanted anything in my life. I wanted to just dissolve into that light, into that love, and forget the name Mark Riley and the broken world he came from. I tried to communicate this, to just think the words, "Please, let me stay here." But his answer wasn't a yes or a no. It was a new understanding. He let me feel the purpose he had for me. It wasn't a command barked from a general. It was an infusion of meaning, the very thing my soul had been starving for since the day I was born. He showed me a vision, not of the past, but of the future. He showed me faces, people I'd never met, in places I'd never been, and he let me feel their quiet desperation, their silent questions, the same emptiness I had carried in that gray apartment. They were all just like me. They were all living in a cell with the door wide open. And then his voice, a thought that was more real than any sound, gave me my new mission. "Your war is not over, my son. It has just begun. But this time you fight with me. What you have seen you must now speak. You who were blind will be my witness." It wasn't a choice between heaven and earth. It was a choice between staying in safety or going back into the fight for the sake of others. For a soldier, there's only one answer to a call like that. And for the first time, I knew who I was fighting for. The moment I accepted, the transition began. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and that perfect golden world began to fade. It wasn't a gentle departure. It was a violent yank backward, like being sucked out of an airplane. The feeling of love and light was ripped away, replaced by an incoming rush of everything else. The cold, the weight of my own body, the screaming pain from 100 different wounds all firing at once. My first sensation was the grit of sand in my mouth, then the smell of burning fuel and blood. The light of heaven was gone, replaced by the harsh, blinding Iraqi sun reflecting off a medic's tool. The silence was shattered by desperate, frantic shouting. "He's back, we got a pulse, we got a pulse." I felt a jolt as the defibrillator paddles hit my chest again, a crude lightning bolt compared to the gentle light I'd just left. My eyes flew open. I gasped, a ragged, desperate breath that felt like I was breathing in fire and glass. I was back in the wreckage, back in the pain. A medic was leaning over me, his face a mix of shock and relief. But I wasn't really looking at him. I was looking past him up at that empty blue sky, and tears were streaming down my face. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of loss. I'd been home and I had been sent away. What would you do if you were given a second chance, but it meant leaving paradise to come back to a broken world? Subscribe and hit that bell, because how I came back to life and what happened when I tried to tell everyone what I saw is a story you won't want to miss. I'll be sharing more stories just like this one. Waking up wasn't a gentle process, it was a violent eviction. One moment I was bathed in a love that was more real than matter itself. The next I was being slammed back into a broken container of flesh and bone. The first thing I felt was pain. A deep, searing fire that started in my chest and radiated out to every part of my body. It was a brutal reminder that I was back in a world where things could break. My eyes snapped open to a white ceiling. Not the living golden light of heaven, but a dead, sterile white lit by humming fluorescent tubes. The air didn't feel like love. It smelled of antiseptic and bleach. And the sound was a steady, rhythmic beeping from a machine next to my head. Beep, beep, beep. A cheap, mechanical imitation of a heartbeat, my heartbeat. A doctor was shining a light in my eyes, his voice a muffled drone. "Sergeant Riley, can you hear me? You're in Landstuhl, Germany. You've been out for 3 days. 3 days. I tried to speak, to ask what happened, but all that came out was a dry, ragged cough. A nurse helped me sip some water. My parents were there, standing at the foot of the bed. My mom was crying, her hands clasped together like she was praying. My dad, a man I'd never seen, shed a tear, just stared at me, his face pale with a mixture of shock and relief. They saw a miracle. Their son, brought back from the dead. But as I looked at their loving, worried faces, a wave of the most profound loneliness I'd ever known washed over me. They couldn't see it. They couldn't know where I had just been. I was home, but I had never felt more like a stranger. But what happened next was even worse. The first time I tried to tell someone, it was my mother. She was sitting by my bedside, holding my hand. Her eyes were filled with so much joy. "It's a miracle, Mark," she whispered. "We prayed so hard." I looked at her and the words just tumbled out of me, weak and raspy. "Mom, I saw him. I saw Jesus." Her smile froze. She squeezed my hand a little too tight and gave me that look. The one you give a child who's talking about an imaginary friend. "Oh, honey," she said softly. "You've been through so much. The doctors said you'd be confused. Just rest. She thought it was the morphine. The doctors thought it was trauma-induced hallucination. A psychiatrist came to talk to me about PTSD. Everyone had a neat little box to put my experience in, a label that would make it safe and understandable. They heard my words, but they didn't listen. It was like I had learned a new language that no one else could speak. I'd been given the most important message in the history of the world, and the second I tried to deliver it, I was dismissed as a broken man. The old Mark, the skeptic, would have done the exact same thing. And that irony was a heavier weight than any of my physical injuries. The days blurred into weeks. I was flown back to the States to Walter Reed. I learned to walk again. I went through physical therapy, my body slowly knitting itself back together. But my mind, my soul, that was a different story. I'd look in the mirror and not recognize the man staring back. His eyes had seen things the rest of his face couldn't comprehend. The old Mark Riley was dead. He died in that Humvee. I was someone else now, a visitor in his life, a soldier sent back with a new set of orders. But how do you fight a war when everyone thinks you're crazy? What would you do if you were given the absolute truth but no one was willing to believe you? Subscribe and hit that bell, because trying to convince a world of skeptics when you used to be their king is a battle all its own. I'll be sharing more stories just like this one. The hardest part about coming back wasn't learning to walk again. It was learning to live in a world that suddenly felt faded. It was like I'd spent my whole life watching a movie in black and white, and then, for 8 minutes, someone showed it to me in brilliant living color, and then they shut it off again. I was back in the gray world, but now I knew what I was missing. Everything tasted a little blander. The sun felt a little less warm, because I had felt the source of all warmth. My relationships fractured, not with a big bang, but with a slow, quiet drift. My army buddies would visit, and they'd try to talk about the old days, about football, about getting a beer, and I'd just nod and smile, but my mind was somewhere else. They were talking about a world of cause and effect, and I was now living in a world of grace and mystery. We were speaking different languages. They saw a guy who had survived. I knew I was a man who had been rescued. After a while, the visits became less frequent. The silence was easier than the pretending. I even thought about Jenna. I looked her up online one night, my fingers hesitating over the keyboard. I found her. She was married, had 2 kids, in a beautiful house with a white picket fence. In her profile picture, she was standing with her family in front of a little country church. And she had that same light in her eyes, I remembered. That light I used to think was foolish. I just closed the laptop. What could I possibly say to her? I remember how you said the world was full of magic. Well, you were right. I know, because I died and came back. She had found her peace. I couldn't risk shattering it. The real transformation began in the quiet moments. I'd be sitting in my small, government-subsidized apartment, the same kind of gray room I ran from when I joined the army. But it wasn't empty anymore. I could feel that presence, that same loving peace, waiting in the silence. It wasn't a voice, it was just a knowing. I realized my mission wasn't to build a church or shout from a street corner. My mission was simply to be a witness to the truth that had saved me. You are not alone. That was the lie that had defined my entire life, and it was the core of the darkness I had felt in that void. So I started small. I bought a cheap webcam. I sat down in my spare room in front of a bare wall, and I hit record. The hands were shaking. I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't a public speaker. I was a broken soldier with a story that sounded insane. But I remembered his words, "You who were a skeptic will be my living witness." My weakness wasn't a liability, it was my qualification. I didn't have a script, I just started talking. I talked about the hardware store, about Jenna, about the silence in Ramadi. I talked about the darkness and the fear. And then I talked about the light. I uploaded that first video, my heart pounding in my chest, and I thought maybe 5 people would see it. But then I woke up the next morning to thousands of comments. People telling me their own stories of loss, of doubt, of feeling completely and utterly alone. And in that moment, I finally understood. He didn't send me back for my sake. He sent me back for theirs. My purpose wasn't just to live again. It was to help others feel the hope that there is more to this life than just the gray. Have you ever felt so alone that you thought no one in the universe could possibly understand? Subscribe and hit that bell, because the stories of the people who reached out to me after that first video, and how we started to build a community of hope, is a journey you need to see. I'll be sharing more stories just like this one. That first video, I honestly thought it would be the end of it. I'd put my story out there and that would be that. But when I woke up the next morning and saw the thousands of comments, my hands started shaking all over again. They weren't from people calling me crazy. They were from people all over the world writing things like, "I thought I was the only one who felt that cold," or "I've been living in that gray room my whole life." Reading their words, I realized the most important part of my mission. He didn't send me back just to tell my story. He sent me back to listen to theirs. My life isn't defined by the 8 minutes I was dead. It's defined by what I've done every day since. The man I am now, he isn't afraid of the silence anymore, because I know it isn't empty. I've learned that faith isn't about seeing angels or floating in a sea of light. It's about what you do in the dark. It's about choosing to believe there's a hand reaching for you even when you can't see it. It's about understanding that the deepest lie the darkness ever told us is that we are alone. I went to war believing only in what I could see and touch. I came back knowing the truest reality is the one we can't see. I'm not asking you to believe every detail of my story. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that you are more than just a random collection of atoms, that your life isn't just a cosmic accident, because I am living proof that even when you don't believe in him, he believes in you, and his hand is always outstretched, waiting for you to take it. What do you think is the real purpose of a second chance? Subscribe and hit that bell, because this journey is just getting started. I'll be sharing more stories of hope and rescue in the next video. You're not going to want to miss it.